So good to see you.
Likewise, how are you?
I met Ambassador Sarukhan in Washington, D.C., where he's a professor of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He believes one of the most important issues for Mexico in the region is trade.
With NAFTA and now with USMCA, one of the unsung stories of North American economic integration is that you don't produce US goods, we don't produce Mexican goods, the Canadians don't produce Canadian goods. We're producing North American goods because our supply chains and our production platforms have become completely integrated. But it's this issue, these integrated supply chains, that was completely exposed and disrupted when our economies shut down, when Ottawa, Washington, and Mexico City started designating essential sectors, strategic sectors, and none of the three capitals thought of, oh my God, we've got to coordinate so that my essential sectors are your essential sectors, and we don't further disrupt supply chains, which is something that we're still battling with today. So far it's early to determine the real impact and the success of this renegotiated free trade agreement. But if one thing it has done, it has underscored why Canada, the US, and Mexico, particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic, need to understand that our joint competitiveness can only be guaranteed if we bulletproof, Teflon coat, deepen our supply chains in North America.
Opponents of NAFTA argue that U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost since many industries moved parts of their operations to Mexico, where labor is cheaper. While in Mexico, millions of farmers were put out of business. U.S. farmers received subsidies of as much as 40% of their costs for producing corn and other grains that were sold to Mexico at below market cost. Rural Mexican farmers simply could not compete.
We've heard this from a number of politicians. There's this aggrieved spirit in the United States. I lost my jobs because of that. It's terrible. And this kind of entrenched belief that, we've got to be protectionist, globalization's terrible. And it's all a myth. Can you talk about that?
It's a complete myth, but it also, I think, shines light on one of the big mistakes that policymakers, politicians, parliamentarians in Canada, members of Congress in the US and Mexico, a sin of omission throughout the 20 plus years of NAFTA, which is how we spoke about NAFTA and the narrative that we created about NAFTA, and more importantly, that despite the success story that NAFTA is, there was no effort done to retrain people that effectively did lose their jobs. And so one of the lessons is, how do you continue to build this platform of enhanced competitiveness as the US undergoes what I think is the most important recalibration of its foreign and national security policies since the end of the Cold War vis-a-vis China and competitiveness with China? How does this integration of supply chains, of greater competitiveness in North America, allow us to be more competitive on the global scene? But that will only happen if we also understand that there is labor dislocation. The people have lost their jobs in the three countries. The number of jobs accrued as a result of NAFTA is modest. It's not a huge number, but there was certainly no net job loss as a result of NAFTA. But the great lesson, I think, and in part that's why there is this 6-year revision process of USMCA that was included in the renegotiation, because the idea is, how can we make sure that we don't fall asleep at the wheel, that we understand how the global economy is changing, how the labor markets of our three countries are changing, so we can adjust, retrain those that we need to retrain and give them another opportunity, because even if we didn't have trade, automation is going to end up displacing jobs. So how do we confront automation? How do we build a strong economy? Whereas NAFTA was built on the success of manufacturing and of the automotive industry, the success of USMCA is going to be digital. It's going to be the digital economy. It's going to be the electronic tablets that drive the autonomous driving cars. It's going to be the semiconductors, the chips. That is the future success of USMCA. And it's going to mean, simply because of technology, of robotization, that there will be people losing their jobs across North America. So how do you confront that? How do you prepare for that? How do you help people retrain, rewire, so they're not left without a job?
In 2021, the United States experienced the highest number of arrests in history by the Border Patrol at the Mexican frontier. At the same time, around 1 million undocumented immigrants were granted permits to work in the U.S.
One of the other issues that, of course, Donald Trump ran on was that there was a problem at the border, and that is not relaxed at all with the Biden administration. What's fueling that? And it never seems like here in Washington they ever have kind of a comprehensive, kind of holistic view of like, how do we really address this? Obviously, putting up a wall is not going to settle it. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Look, the wall, I always said that the wall, or any wall, is a 1st century BC solution to 21st century problems. It's not going to solve anything. Janet Napolitano, who was at the time governor of Arizona, when she said this, famously said, "Show me a 20-foot a wall and I'll show you a 21-foot ladder." Enough said about walls. The border is a very challenging ecosystem because it is an area of huge economic dynamism. People forget that Mexico and the United States trade on any given day $1.5 billion a day of goods, go back and forth across the border. 1 million people cross the border legally in both directions. Well, before the pandemic, and now it's starting to pick up again because the border was closed. But it is an extremely dynamic economic region. At the same time, because of the economic and societal asymmetries between the US, Mexico, and the rest of Latin America, it's an opportunity for this phenomenon that we've seen of unauthorized migration, not from Mexico, but from other parts of the Americas, coming through Mexico on its way to the United States. We had never seen the number of people on the move across, up and down the Americas that we have today, whether they're refugees or migrants or internally displaced people. And they're not only on the US-Mexico border, they're Haitians that have flown into Brazil and Argentina, and they're moving up the hemisphere, crossing the Darien Gap, which is this intransitable area of between Panama and Colombia. I've always said, if migrants can cross the Darien Gap, you really think you're going to be able to stop them on the US-Mexico border?
It's a good point.
So the only way that Mexico and the United States and other countries can deal with the issue of unauthorized migration is A, understanding that you can't enforce your way out of migration crises. B, that you need to deal with the structural drivers of migration, be they economic, societal, or security driven. And that the only way you're going to address this long term is by investing in those core drivers of expulsion. Economic opportunity, greater human security, the resilience of institutions, opportunities, much in the same way that you saw Mexico, despite the narrative out there, by Mexico starting to grow its middle class in the last decade and a half. What you started seeing was that migration of Mexicans to the United States dropped to zero and then became negative. That is, more Mexicans were going back than Mexicans coming across. And it was a combination of factors. It was because it was much harder to cross the border because of border security measures that were put in place after 9/11. But it's also that the Mexican economy started to grow and started to anchor Mexicans in Mexico. And the problem that you now have in the Northern Triangle of Central America, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, obviously in Haiti with earthquakes and military coups, is it's either driven by issues of public security, Haiti, notably Honduras and El Salvador. Guatemala less. Guatemala is more driven by economics and climate change. There's a huge drought in the northern part of Guatemala, which is impacting coffee plantations in the region, which is driving a lot of people in search for jobs. But unless you start understanding that there is no quick fix solution, that you're going to have to invest 10, 15 years to start moving the needle in these countries, creating jobs, enhancing security, enhancing the rule of law, we're going to be playing this game endlessly over the next years. This story that we've seen these past years on the US-Mexico border is going to repeat itself every single couple of years.
Ambassador Sarukhan served as a career diplomat in the Mexican Foreign Service for 22 years. He received the rank of Career Ambassador in 2006.
I was Consul General at the time, so I was there.
From 2007 to 2013, he served as Mexico's ambassador to the United States.
Years later,
You have such an interesting career as a diplomat. What's that like, being in one of those intense negotiations?
Well, it's fascinating. I did this for 20 plus years of my life, but it's hard work because you have to have clarity as to what you need to achieve, what your goals and objectives are, but at the same time to be fully cognizant of what the other side's limits, deliverables, red lines are, understand what makes them tick, and obviously also strive to find something where both sides will feel that they've obtained something, that it isn't a zero-sum game, that there, you win some and you lose some, but you find an equilibrium which will, in the case of diplomacy, serve the interests of both countries and deepen and widen the relationship. And what's also fascinating is the human connections that you create along the way.
It's interesting. I interviewed the South African ambassador to the United States after Nelson Mandela's death, and he talked about the one thing that he learned about him was that Mandela in any conversation was always inside that person's head. What does this person need? Where are they coming from? And he understood that person better than they did in some respects. That's a key ingredient, isn't it, to be a good diplomat?
It is, and it's not easy to achieve. It's guts. It's understanding the person, his or her context, and it's not easy. Not all diplomats achieve that level of excellence.
COVID-19 has been a major challenge for many countries in Latin America, from little access to vaccines to overflowing hospitals and a lack of ICU beds.
Let's talk about COVID because it's the pandemic's leveled so many economies and hammered so many countries from an economic standpoint. How has Mexico, kind of made its way through this storm? And barely. And what are some kind of the residual impacts that we're going to see for a long time to come?
I think that's a very, very important question, not only for Mexico, but a lot of the countries in Latin America in particular, which is what will COVID end up doing to the social contract, to social resiliency, and to political effervescence in the region. Mexico is unique that it is one of the very, very few countries that decided not to put in place economic and societal programs to mitigate the pandemic. There were no checks, no economic stimuli to small businesses. The president decided that he was not going to spend. At the end of the day, that means that compared to Brazil, Mexico is not indebted. But the problem is the impact that this has had on schools being closed and kids being out of school, on small and micro businesses that were not given support by the government. In a couple of years, you could start seeing some very important manifestations of this. And you could see what we had eliminated in the US-Mexico relationship until 2-3 years ago, which was that the numbers of Mexicans crossing the border without papers had gone down. And one of the potential impacts of this is that you may start seeing, which we've already started seeing in the last months, an uptick of Mexicans also starting to cross the border illegally in search of jobs in the United States. So the handling of the pandemic has not been one of the most stellar moments of this current Mexican government. On the contrary, it has been extremely criticized by how Obviously, the president, like other leaders around the world, decided that face masks aren't needed, that it's not, he never used a face mask. He's now fallen sick to COVID twice. I think that they bet the farm on sort of immunization by default, by having so many people immunized that the antibodies to COVID would allow a country to skirt the pandemic. Mexico has some of the highest rates of mortality in the world. It has some of the lowest vaccination rates in the world. So it is not a shining moment for Mexico's public health policy.
How does it dig itself out of this?
Well, hopefully by understanding how important the economic and trade synergies with its two North American partners are, and how you continue to build upon a success story in North America of trade, because that is a very important motor for Mexico's economy. But that won't solve one of the huge paradoxes and challenges that we face in Mexico, which is that NAFTA, and now USMCA, has been a motor of growth for the central and northern part of the country. You have states in Mexico that have been growing at 6-7% until the pandemic hit. Whereas if you go to the southern part of Mexico, these are states that have very low, even negative levels of growth. So how do you anchor the southern part of Mexico to the economic and trade success story that NAFTA, now USMCA, have promised? And that's going to be an important issue in the years ahead. If Mexico doesn't solve that conundrum, whether it's this government or the government that will come in 2024, that's going to be an important issue for Mexico's economic well-being.
You know, one of the things I think about with the pandemic, I want to get your thoughts on this, and we hear a lot about it here in the U.S. We got to extend broadband. We got to get it to these rural communities. They just don't have access to it. These kids are going to fall behind. Kids are already falling behind with the virtual learning. It's not the same as being in a classroom and how dynamic that can be. And then I think of areas like you're describing, where it may not even be that spotty internet is difficult.
There's no internet.
There's no internet. Nobody has these laptops, these devices. How far behind, you're talking about in the next few years we're going to see, but I mean, this could be like generational, right?
I think we will see, and this is probably going to be something prevalent up and down Latin America and the Caribbean. I think you're going to see a generation of kids from Latin American countries that will have lost 2-3 years of their lives and of their education. And the tragedy is that some abandoned school because there was no school, and they're probably not going to come back. They found a job, they've been working to help sustain and support their families. And this is one of the reasons why during the last North American Leaders Summit that took place here in November of last year, Biden finally reconvened the North American Leaders Summit after 4 years of hiatus with Trump, who ignored the North American Leaders Summit. One of the issues was how do we make sure that we can provide internet coverage and 5G coverage and bandwidth to parts of Mexico where this is critically important, not only for educational purposes and human capital, but also for competitiveness and economic growth. And so it's already been identified as a key issue on which Mexico, the United States, and Canada will work in the context of the North American Leaders Summit.
Arturo, so many insights. Thanks so much.
Thank you.